Today we got a Subaru Forester 2011 and we got to do the power steering pump on it. So we're going to start by pulling off the serpentine belt, and that's held on by this tensioner pulley right here, right there, which is a 14 millimeter. And then yeah, that's the first step. You don't have to take the belt completely off if you're just doing the power steering pump. I just got mine kind of tucked to the right, but all you do is pull the 14 millimeter clockwise and your belt should be loose. So the next step is we're going to be pulling off the power steering lines, which is these two on top. So we got a hose clamp, and then we got another 14 millimeter, I believe, and it's going to leak oil, so make sure you have a drain pan underneath your car. That's just a 14 millimeter. Once you get that off, make sure you don't lose that because we're going to be needing that. So what we're going to want to do is pull this off and also keep that, don't lose it, and then just grab your line and kind of tuck it out of the way to somewhere it's that one's not going to be leaking too much, but yeah, so just kind of move that out of the way. And then we're going to have to pull off this one, which is just a hose clamp. So for me, this hose is actually like really hard and brittle, like all the way around, so I'm going to need to replace this hose as well, and you can see it's cracking at the end, but that's just from the reservoir to the pump, so it's not a huge deal. But yeah, so I'm going to have to go pick up a new hose. But next step is actually going to be unplugging this electrical connector, and then we have our two power steering bolts. Unplugging the electrical connector is pretty easy. All you got to do is just push this tab down and then pull out, and that's out of there. So then our next step, I have this hose is leaking everywhere. I'm just gonna move it out of the way. Next step is going to be pulling off these 13 millimeters, and you're going to be able to get these by lining up the power steering pulley with those bolts. So I'm going to get a deep bolt 13 and then just put it in there and get those bolts loose. Okay, it turns out the bolts are actually 12s, but same thing. So we just got to put it in there and then you can get the bolts loose with this. So same thing on this side, you just want to put it through here and then line it up, make sure it's on there good, and then just get that loose nice and easy. And then yeah, I'll pull these out right now. Alright, so we kind of got a change of plans here. So there's a third power steering bolt that holds it on, which is right there, and then that crosses on the bottom. I didn't see that one at first, but the problem with this bolt is that it is literally 6 inches long, so you have no room to get the bolt off. So now what we got to do is pull this power steering bracket completely off, and to get that off we're gonna pull the alternator real quick, but it's not a big problem, and if you're still sticking with me, we got this. So I'll start with pulling the alternator off real quick, and we're just gonna have to zip these 3 bolts off, I believe. So these 3 bolts, I'm gonna start with this 10, pull this top little bracket off, and then we're gonna pull off these 3 bolts, followed by the power and the plug, and then the alternator should lift out. And then we just got these 2 bolts right here for the power steering bracket, and then I believe it should lift out of there with any luck. So all that holds this bracket on is just the 10 millimeter that was right there, followed by the alternator bolt, which is a 14 millimeter. Now we have the plug, which is pretty simple to get out. All you gotta do is just push on this tab and then give it a pull. And then for this, you also have a little tab right here that you lift up on, and that's our power cable. But we're gonna be disconnecting the battery so we don't ground ourselves out. Make sure you disconnect the battery first before you do anything, and then pull the power off. So after you got your battery disconnected, mine is a couple 10 millimeters, Then you go back in here, and then we're gonna pull this 13 off, the power for the alternator. And then there's 2 more bolts, and the alternator should lift out. Okay, so turns out this is getting a little more tricky than I thought. I did not see this alternator bolt down there, which is not a big deal. We still got this, don't worry. All we gotta do is pull off this pulley right here, and that'll give us access to the last alternator bolt. I got this one, I just pulled it off the AC compressor, that's fine. I just disconnected this, that's a 12mm. So we got one more right there after we pull this pulley off. That is just a 14mm bolt, and then after you get this off, the pulley just literally drops out nice and easy. And now we have access to the last 14mm alternator. Okay, and just like that, we have the alternator off, and it gives us access to remove the bracket. So to remove the bracket, it looks like we have 4 bolts. That's what it looks like. We got 14 right here, right there, the greasy guy. And then there's one more right there, if you can see that. Let me see if I can zoom in, right there. And then after that, we should be able to pull the power steering pump off. This is definitely the most tricky bolt to get out of them all, just because it's kind of like the hardest to reach. But I'm using a deep well 14 and a 3-inch extension, and it kind of gives you enough room to get it out. But if you're having trouble with this, then you can just pull the upper radiator hose. But you should be able to get it with just a deep well socket and a 3-inch extension like I did. So I have one more, the greasy guy, and then this should be able to lift up and out of here. So after you get the last bolt out, which was right there, this literally just lifts up and out of the car, nice and easy. So before I started the job, I pressure washed the car all off, and I noticed that there was oil right in here, and it was power steering fluid. But yeah, so that was definitely where it was leaking, and it was just kind of running all over the place, as you can tell. So I'm gonna move on to the next step. So for whatever reason, Subaru decided to put this 10-inch long bolt in the power steering pump to hold it for the last one. I just thought it was gonna be those 2, you know, I thought it was gonna be a nice and easy job, but turns out it was a little bit tougher than I expected, but it's still not that hard. So now we just have to remove the power steering pump from the bracket, and I'll do that right now. So it's fairly simple to separate. All I did was just use the screwdriver, and then I just pried in between the power steering pump and the bracket, and it came right off. All right, so I have the new power steering pump attached to the bracket, and I have the back bolt in there already. So it's pretty easy to get in there, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna put the bolts in now so that we don't have to do it inside of the car. So I'm gonna start by just getting these other 2 bolts lined up here, and then we're gonna tighten those up, and then we're gonna tighten up the back one. All right, so I have mine all in and tight. I would recommend just starting the 3 first before you tighten them all, but yeah, it's pretty simple. Okay, so I got the bracket all mounted back in there, and it's pretty much just a process of remembering what went where. So there's 4 bolts that held this on, so one there, the greasy guy, and then that tricky one right down in there. It's not too hard, just make sure you start them all first and then tighten them all, just so you can line the bracket up nice and properly. And now we are ready to put the alternator back in. So this is pretty much just the same thing, just kind of remembering where everything went. So we had the bracket on top with the 10mm, and then that bracket was also held down by alternator bolt, and then we had the alternator bolt right there, as well as those 2 right there. So now after you get everything tight, we're ready to put the idler pulley back on. Okay, so I got everything back on. I got the idler pulley tight, and I also got our power line and connector for the alternator. So now we are ready for the new hose for the power steering pump, and we can also connect the other one, but we could also throw the serpentine belt back on now. And other than that, we just got to connect the battery, and this is pretty much wrapped up. Okay, so to connect this line, you just really want to make sure everything's nice and clean, but all you do is you're going to put the gasket back in there. Let us set this down really fast. And then you put your bolt back in, and then this will just screw back in there nice and easy. But just make sure everything's nice and clean, just so you don't have any leaks or any dirt or grime holding it up, and yeah, that would be bad. Okay, so I got the serpentine belt back on, and I'll put up a diagram of what I use just to see how the belt was routed. So the last and final step would be to connect your last power steering hose to here with just this hose clamp. Last step is very simple, but I'm gonna go out and buy a whole new hose, and to do that, it's also very simple, but you're gonna have to drain this reservoir and disconnect the hose right here, put the new one on with the 2 hose clamps. Pretty simple, but that is how you do a power steering pump on a 2011 Subaru Forester with a 2.5.